Hey there, and welcome to tonight's journey. As you settle in, dim the lights, and let the atmosphere guide you, take a moment to close your eyes. Picture this: Victorian London, a city unlike the one painted in the novels. No grand palace gardens or horse-drawn carriages gliding past ornate mansions. This isn't the London of elegant ball gowns or Sherlock Holmes solving mysteries over afternoon tea. No, tonight we step into the gritty, grimy heart of a city where survival was, well, a small miracle every single day. You're standing in the middle of it now. The fog is thick, a dense, suffocating blanket that wraps around you. It's not the romantic mist that lingers in the novels, where it looks all picturesque and mysterious. This is the infamous pea soup fog, a toxic concoction of coal, smoke, and damp mist that seems to swallow everything in its path. You can barely see your own hand in front of your face, and the air, thick with soot, clings to your skin. The gas lamps barely flicker through the haze, their dim light doing little to illuminate the muddy streets. The surrounding sounds are equally overwhelming. Horses clip-clop across the cobblestones, carts rattle by, their wheels cutting through the grime. But you can't make out the faces of the people passing by. All you hear are muffled voices, faint coughs, and the occasional shout another argument over stolen coal or the butcher's offcuts. But don't bother looking. It's the same every day. The buildings around you rise like dark, looming giants, their windows grimy and closed off to the outside world. The air smells of waste, raw sewage, coal, and that overcooked cabbage scent that wafts from almost every kitchen in the city. And just as you take a breath, you realize something. You've never tasted air so thick, so heavy, that it makes your lungs ache with every inhale. Now, before we dive any deeper into this fog of misery, take a moment to reflect. This city, this place, wasn't built for comfort. It was built on the sweat, blood, and broken bodies of its workers. It wasn't the grandeur of the empire that you're likely to imagine when thinking of Victorian London, but the harsh, unforgiving reality of survival. Today, we're going to explore what life was really like here, a world where every day felt like a battle against disease, poverty, and a relentless, unforgiving city. So, if you've ever wondered how people survived in this dark, polluted maze of industry and desperation, tonight's story will give you a glimpse into the heart of it all. We'll see how the working class, often forgotten by history, fought to keep their heads above water, and we'll focus on survival, on what it took to simply make it to the end of the day. Believe me, getting through even a single day in this world was a victory. But before we begin, if you're enjoying this journey into the past, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Let me know in the comments, where are you tuning in from tonight? And what time is it for you? It's always fascinating to see how far and wide our stories stretch. Now, let's step into the murk, into the fog, into Victorian London. Ready? Here we go. Imagine the very first step you take out of your small, damp room in Victorian London. The air feels heavier than it should, thick with soot, fog, and the lingering stench of human life. The streets are filthy, caked with mud, horse manure, and refuse, as though the city itself had no room for cleanliness or care. Everything around you seems to be coated in grime, and the constant, incessant smell of rot clings to your clothes and skin, lingering as if it were part of your very being. In the heart of this industrial city, life is as grim as the air that surrounds you. London, once the proud center of the British Empire, is now a sprawling urban nightmare, teeming with people crammed together in overcrowded tenements, huddling in whatever crevices they can find. There's no separation between work, life, and survival. Every breath you take is tinged with the bitter scent of industrial progress, a city rising on the backs of the poorest, while the wealthy live in their grand estates, blissfully unaware, or at least indifferent to the suffering below. The smell of the streets in Victorian London tells the story of the city's neglect and desperation. The air is thick with smoke, thanks to the coal-burning factories, stoves, and the thousands of chimneys that line the skyline. The streets are muddy from constant rain, mixing with the filth that has accumulated over weeks, months, and years. It's not just dirt, it's human waste, the remnants of meals, animal excrement, and industrial sludge. There are no proper sewers, and any plumbing that might exist is a luxury only afforded to the upper classes. The gutters run with this waste, and with every step you take, your boots sink into it, leaving behind a trail of grime that no one seems to mind. This overwhelming squalor defines life in the slums of Victorian London. If you live in the working class districts, you're lucky to have a small room that may or may not have windows, but the chance of it being dry is almost non-existent. The tenements, small and cramped, are poorly constructed, with walls that may be crumbling, floors that creak and moan under the weight of daily existence, and ceilings that leak whenever it rains. The buildings themselves feel as though they're slowly sinking into the dirt, worn down by the weight of the people inside them. The plaster on the walls is chipped, worn, and often barely holding up, with exposed beams and damp patches staining the surfaces. Even when it's not raining, your room is never truly dry. The dampness seeps into everything: the floorboards, the walls, the furniture that's so old it might as well have been left behind by the previous century. The smell of mildew is constant, seeping into the very air you breathe, and the dampness makes the chill of the night all the more unbearable. Heating is minimal, if it even exists at all, and if there is a fireplace, it's likely nothing more than a crumbling, barely functioning contraption that does little to ward off the biting cold of a London winter. Your bedding is just as grim. You sleep on a thin straw mattress, a remnant of someone's discarded bedding, with a thin wool blanket that hasn't been washed in years. It smells faintly of sweat and the unmistakable odor of 1,000 forgotten nights. The pillow, if you can even call it that, is nothing more than a handful of straw shoved into a sack. There's nothing comfortable about it. It's just a place to lay your head, an unfortunate necessity in a world where comfort is a luxury you can't afford. The filth that clings to your body after a night of fitful sleep will remain with you all day, as there is no real means of washing up. If you're lucky, you might have access to a basin of water that's been left to sit all night, its surface already covered in grime. But the room itself isn't the worst part of this squalor. What truly defines your existence is the pervasive sense of decay that permeates every aspect of life in Victorian London. The city seems to be falling apart at the seams, as though the very foundation of society is on the brink of collapse. You are surrounded by people who live in a constant state of struggle, fighting not just for survival, but for a sense of dignity in a place that offers them little of either. And yet, despite the constant presence of filth, there's a strange sense of routine that makes the squalor somewhat bearable. You wake up to the sounds of your neighbors who share the same cramped, overcrowded conditions. You hear them shuffling about, going through the same motions, performing the same rituals, as if this squalor was simply what life had become. You've learned to breathe through your mouth in the mornings, to block out the smells that cling to the air, because that's what survival in Victorian London requires: an ability to endure, to carry on despite the overwhelming circumstances. The streets outside aren't much better. As you step out into the gray, choking fog that shrouds the city, you are met with the sight of people moving quickly, heads down, shoulders hunched against the cold and the grime. Horses pull carts through the muck, their hooves splashing through puddles of sewage and waste, leaving behind streaks of filth as they move along. The clattering of wheels on cobblestones blends with the shouts of vendors hawking their wares, many of which are questionable at best. The sounds of street urchins arguing over the scraps of food they've managed to collect from the gutters fill the air, mixing with the cries of beggars. The frantic calls of those trying to avoid being crushed under the wheels of the next passing cart. In Victorian London, the streets are not just dirty, they are dangerous. The combination of filth and poverty creates a breeding ground for disease, and every step you take through the streets is a calculated risk. You're constantly aware of the likelihood of slipping in the muck, of being caught in the thick fog that makes it impossible to see where you're going, or of being trampled under the feet of a passing horse or carriage. The roads themselves are poorly maintained, crumbling under the weight of so much traffic, and there are no sidewalks, only narrow pathways that often disappear into the muck. Walking through these streets feels like a gauntlet, a series of hazards that could end in injury or even death if you're not careful. And if the streets themselves weren't enough to deal with, there's the constant reminder of the poverty that defines the city. The working-class districts are home to families who struggle to make ends meet, often living in overcrowded conditions where privacy is a luxury they can't afford. The poor are constantly battling not only the filth and the disease that fill the air, but also the constant fear of eviction. Landlords prey on the poorest residents, raising rents or evicting tenants for trivial reasons, knowing that these people have no place else to go. The homeless are a constant presence, with nowhere to turn except to the cold, dangerous streets. But even with all this, the poor of Victorian London endure. They endure because they have no other choice. They adapt to the squalor because survival is the only option. They learn to live with the filth, the smell, and the constant sense of decay that surrounds them. They have no choice but to find a way to exist in this oppressive environment, clinging to whatever scraps of comfort or humanity they can find. In the end, the overwhelming squalor of Victorian London becomes a backdrop against which the resilience of its people is tested. They survive not because life is easy, but because it is the only thing they know. The conditions are harsh, unforgiving, and relentless, but somehow they endure. The filth, the poverty, the disease, it becomes part of the landscape, part of their daily reality. They don't have the luxury of complaining or wishing for better. They make do, day after day, in a city that seems determined to break them down. And as you lie in bed tonight, drifting off to sleep, remember this. In the heart of the filth, the fog, and the squalor, the people of Victorian London lived not because they had easy lives, but because they had to. Their survival was not a testament to the comforts of life, but to the sheer willpower required to get through each day in a world that offered them little in return. The fog in Victorian London wasn't like the gentle mists that are often romanticized in literature. It was a choking, oppressive cloud that hung over the city, thick with coal smoke and industrial pollution. It wasn't just a natural phenomenon. It was the product of the rapid industrialization that had come to define the city in the 19th century. London's streets, once vibrant and bustling, were now concealed beneath a blanket of toxic mist. Each morning, as the city stirred to life, the fog made its presence known, suffocating the air and turning the streets into an impenetrable maze of gray. As you stepped outside, the fog instantly swallowed you. You could barely see a few feet ahead. The outlines of buildings once familiar were now blurred, hazy figures in the distance. You might catch a glimpse of a horse-drawn cart or a distant lamppost, but everything was muffled by the thickness of the air. The street, which should have been bustling with life, was transformed into a shadowy, indistinct world. The air was dense, clinging to everything it touched, and as it seeped into your lungs, it felt like you were breathing through a wet cloth. The fog wasn't just a mist. It was a living, suffocating entity that had merged with the smoke from the coal fires and the exhaust from the factories that powered the city. It was a byproduct of the Industrial Revolution, a necessary evil of progress, but one that cost the city its breath. The fog was not just uncomfortable, it was toxic. It was a silent killer that crept into the lungs of everyone who lived and worked in London. The factories, burning coal day and night to power machines, poured smoke into the air, and the streets were filled with it. The lack of proper waste disposal meant that the air was contaminated with every kind of filth, horse manure, sewage, and industrial waste. This mixture hung in the air, making each breath feel heavier than the last. Children coughed incessantly as they walked through the streets, their little bodies struggling to breathe in the polluted air. The elderly weren't immune either. You could hear the wheeze of their breath as they shuffled along, and it was common for the older generations to die early, their lungs having succumbed to the harsh, smoky air. For the people living in the working-class neighborhoods, this fog was just another part of their daily struggle. There was no escaping it. It wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a constant reminder of how the city had been built on the backs of the poor, the ones who had to endure the worst of it. The wealthy could retreat into their mansions, shielded from the worst of the fog. But for the poor, it was an ever-present reality. They lived in overcrowded tenements where the air was thick with smoke, and the fog seeped through the cracks in the walls. Every morning, when they awoke, their rooms would be filled with a damp chill, and the fog from outside would creep in, settling like a weight over everything. Navigating the streets was a daily gamble. The fog, thick as it was, made it almost impossible to see what was ahead of you. The lack of visibility made the streets treacherous, especially for the poor, who had to walk miles to get to work. You never knew when you might step into a puddle of muck or trip over an unseen object. The streets were full of danger, and the fog only made it worse. Horses clattered past, their hooves striking the cobblestones with an eerie sound, and if you weren't careful, you could easily be trampled. But it wasn't just the threat of being run over by a horse or a carriage. The fog was the perfect cover for pickpockets and thieves, who used the thick haze to their advantage. In the confusion, it was easy to steal a wallet or snatch a purse without anyone noticing. The police, poorly equipped and underpaid, had little chance of maintaining order in a city so shrouded in mystery and crime. As the fog thickened at night, London became a city of shadows. Street lamps, which could barely pierce the mist during the day, offered little illumination after dark. The streets, already dangerous, became even more so. The gaslights flickered weakly, casting long, twisted shadows across the alleys, making it feel as though danger was lurking around every corner. The city that never slept now seemed to whisper in the darkness, its sounds muffled by the thick fog. The streets were filled with the clatter of horses' hooves, the hurried footsteps of workers trying to get home, and the occasional scream of a woman being harassed by a passerby. The fog, oppressive and thick, made everything feel like it was closing in on you. At night, the fog seemed to take on a life of its own. It curled through the narrow streets, creeping into every corner, making every building feel like a potential trap. The only way to navigate the city after dark was to keep moving, never stopping, never letting the fog take you completely. The mist wrapped itself around the buildings, flowing like water, clinging to the brick walls, and hiding the cracks and crevices where thieves might be lurking. The fog turned London into a ghost town, a city of shadows, where nothing was as it seemed. In the morning, the fog would still linger, a reminder of the city's grim reality. The air would be thick with coal smoke and dampness, and everything would be coated in a layer of soot. You would cough as you walked, your lungs burning with each breath, and there would be no escape from it. The rich might be able to retreat into their homes, but the poor had nowhere to go. The fog, thick and oppressive, was their constant companion, as they struggled to survive in a city that seemed to be suffocating them from every angle. But the fog wasn't just a physical danger. It had a psychological toll as well. Living in a city where the air is constantly thick with pollution, where the fog never seems to lift, where the sun is a rare visitor, takes its toll on a person's spirit. The people of Victorian London lived in a state of perpetual twilight, their days marked by grayness and fog. The sun, when it did make an appearance, was weak and dim, as though the city itself were in a constant state of mourning. The fog created an atmosphere of despair, a sense that life was always clouded over, and it made everything feel distant, disconnected. The people who lived in the working-class neighborhoods were especially affected. They woke up to the fog, and they went to bed with it still hanging in the air. The fog was a constant reminder that their lives were lived in the shadows, that they were always at the mercy of the forces around them. They lived in a world where survival was never guaranteed, and the fog seemed to make that truth even clearer. It was hard to find hope in a city where the sun rarely shone and where the air was always heavy with smoke. The fog was a constant weight on their shoulders, reminding them of the harshness of their lives and the challenges they faced every day. The thick, choking fog of Victorian London was more than just an environmental factor. It was a symbol of the city's transformation, a city built on the backs of the poor, where industrial progress came at the cost of human life. It was a constant reminder of the dangers that the working class faced every day. The fog was not just a physical barrier, it was a psychological one as well. It was a barrier to hope, a barrier to progress, and a barrier to life. And in that fog, the people of Victorian London had no choice but to endure, to survive, and to keep moving forward, one breath at a time. In Victorian London, survival was a daily battle. And it wasn't just the perilous streets or the suffocating fog that posed a threat. It was also the cramped, squalid living conditions that most of the city's inhabitants were forced to endure. The rapid population boom that accompanied the Industrial Revolution saw thousands of people flock to the capital in search of work, but they often found themselves in deplorable housing. The basics of safety, sanitation, and comfort were luxuries that most could only dream of. The average Victorian worker didn't have the luxury of a well-maintained, spacious home. What they had were dark, damp, overcrowded tenements and dilapidated boarding houses that barely met the basic need for shelter. The streets of London were home to millions of people, and the city's infrastructure struggled to keep up with the demand for space. Families, often large, were crammed into rooms that could barely accommodate one person, let alone 6 or 7. Many of these homes lacked the most basic comforts. The floors were usually covered in dirt. The ceilings were low and damp, and the walls, where they existed, were often patched together with whatever materials could be scavenged. The living spaces were so small that it was often impossible for each person to have their own bed. The result was that multiple people, sometimes entire families, shared a single bed, or worse, they slept on the cold, hard floor. In these overcrowded, poorly constructed spaces, there was little to no privacy. Families lived in close quarters, with personal space being an afterthought. The walls were thin, sometimes paper-thin, and the sounds of everyday life were carried across the whole building. You could hear the neighbors' conversations, the crying of children, and the constant hustle and bustle of a city that never seemed to stop. The noise was constant, the air was stale, and the smell was unbearable. And if you had the misfortune of living in a building with multiple families, you likely shared a bathroom, if you had one at all. If there was no indoor plumbing, and for most, there wasn't, it meant that the only bathroom facilities available were a chamber pot or an outdoor privy that could be shared by several people. In the slums, many of these outdoor privies were little more than wooden shacks perched over a pit, with no privacy, no hygiene, and certainly no comfort. Even if you were lucky enough to have an indoor privy, it was often little more than a hole in the ground, poorly ventilated, and often situated next to the kitchen or sleeping area. Waste would pile up in the narrow, damp streets, and the smell would seep into the homes, making the air even more unbearable. The lack of sanitation was a breeding ground for disease. The city's overcrowded conditions made it easy for illnesses to spread like wildfire. Cholera, dysentery, and tuberculosis were rampant in the slums, and the filth and squalor made it nearly impossible to maintain any semblance of hygiene. The water supply, for those who could afford it, was often tainted with sewage, further contributing to the spread of disease. The tenements were not built to last. Many were hastily constructed, with little regard for the safety or well-being of the people who lived in them. In fact, many buildings were so poorly designed that they were considered death traps. They were overcrowded, with the upper floors being even more dangerous. Some buildings had no staircases, forcing people to climb narrow, rickety ladders to get to their tiny rooms. These buildings were fire hazards, with faulty wiring, overcrowded conditions, and often a lack of fire escapes or emergency exits. When fires broke out, and they did, often the death toll was devastating, with entire families being trapped inside. The kitchens, if you could call them that, were little more than a hearth in the corner of a room. Cooking over an open flame in a cramped, poorly ventilated space was a recipe for disaster, and the risk of fire was always present. And when it wasn't the fire, it was the cold. Winter in Victorian London was brutal, and with poor insulation and inadequate heating, many people froze in their homes. Some were forced to wear layers of clothing, sleep in front of a fire, or share body heat just to survive the bitter cold. The cold, damp conditions of the city only made matters worse, as mold and mildew grew in the cracks and corners of homes, contributing to the already poor air quality. But it wasn't just the lack of comfort or safety that made Victorian living conditions unbearable, it was the constant threat of eviction. With rents being so high, landlords often charged exorbitant fees for substandard housing. The working-class families who lived in these cramped conditions had little money left for food or essentials after paying their rent. This led to a constant cycle of debt, with people struggling to make ends meet, often falling behind on payments, and living in constant fear of being thrown out onto the streets. If a tenant fell behind on rent, they risked being evicted, leaving them homeless in a city that had no place for them. The housing market in Victorian London was based on exploitation. Landlords would cram as many tenants into a building as possible, charging them for whatever space was available, and offering little in return. In many cases, landlords took advantage of the poor conditions in their buildings, refusing to make necessary repairs, and demanding rent that was far beyond what people could afford. In some areas, entire blocks of buildings were owned by a single landlord, and these slumlords would often make little or no effort to improve the living conditions for their tenants. They were more concerned with maximizing their profits than with providing decent housing. For the working-class poor, the choice was clear: stay in these squalid conditions or risk being homeless. Those who didn't have a steady job or a reliable income had little hope of finding better housing. The homeless population in Victorian London was massive, and many found themselves sleeping in the streets or in public places, constantly at the mercy of the weather and the dangers of the city. The poor were also forced to contend with the rise of the workhouse, a government-run institution where the destitute were sent to live and work in exchange for food and shelter. The workhouse was designed to be a place of punishment, not comfort. The conditions were grim, and the work was grueling. Those who were sent there often never left, living out their lives in squalor and misery. The working poor didn't have the luxury of privacy or personal space. Families lived in shared rooms, with little room to breathe, let alone rest. Children were born into these conditions and grew up in the same cramped, unhygienic environments. The rooms were dark, damp, and cold, with little to no light or ventilation. The smell of mold, rotting food, and human waste lingered in the air, and the constant noise from the streets outside only added to the sense of chaos and desperation that filled the tenements. The cramped living conditions were a constant reminder of the inequality that defined Victorian society. The rich lived in grand homes, with ample space, comfort, and access to all the luxuries that the city had to offer. But for the poor, life was a daily struggle for survival. They lived in overcrowded, dangerous conditions, with little hope of escape. Even those who managed to find work and move out of the slums often found themselves facing a lifetime of poverty and deprivation. For the majority of Victorians, there was no real opportunity to escape their circumstances. They were trapped in a cycle of poverty, struggling to survive in a city that offered little in the way of support or opportunity. In the cramped, squalid conditions of Victorian London, survival was an act of resilience. The people who lived in these conditions had no choice but to endure, to fight for their survival every day. The rooms they inhabited were not homes, but battlefields, places where they fought for basic needs, for space, for dignity. The physical toll of living in these conditions was immense, but the psychological toll was just as great. To live in a place where hope seemed so distant, where the walls closed in around you, where every day was a fight to simply exist, this was the reality of life for the working poor in Victorian London. In the end, these cramped, unlivable conditions weren't just a fact of life in Victorian London, they were a symptom of a society that had built its wealth on the backs of the poor. The Industrial Revolution had created immense wealth and opportunity for some, but for the majority of people, it had created a world where survival was the only goal, and comfort was a luxury reserved for the few. The cramped living spaces, the lack of sanitation, and the constant threat of illness and eviction were all part of the daily struggle. And for many, the struggle never ended. The inhumane work environments in Victorian London were as harsh and unforgiving as the squalid living conditions that characterized the city's slums. Work in the industrial age was often a soul-crushing experience, a relentless grind that left workers physically broken, mentally exhausted, and emotionally drained. The rapid industrialization of the city created a stark divide between the wealthy, who profited from the labor of others, and the workers, who endured horrific conditions day in and day out. Factories, mills, and docks were the primary places of employment for the working class in Victorian London, and they were built with one purpose in mind: maximizing production and profit. Human lives were expendable in this system, and the labor force was treated with callous indifference. The factory owners were concerned only with output, not the well-being of their workers, who were often seen as nothing more than cogs in a machine. Workers were subjected to long hours, dangerous conditions, and brutal supervision. The work itself was grueling and often life-threatening. Factory floors were cramped, noisy, and hazardous. In textile mills, for example, workers, including children, operated large, heavy machinery without any safety measures in place. The machines were designed to work fast, pushing workers to meet impossible quotas. The constant hum of the machines created an environment so deafening that conversations were impossible. The air was thick with cotton fibers and dust, making it difficult to breathe. Many workers developed respiratory illnesses, such as lung diseases and tuberculosis, from prolonged exposure to the filth and pollution. The lack of proper ventilation in these mills ensured that the air remained toxic, a deadly environment that workers had no choice but to endure in order to survive. The factory owners made little attempt to ensure the safety of their workers. There were no safety guards on the machines, and accidents were frequent. Workers had to move at a rapid pace, often working alongside dangerous machinery with sharp blades, spinning wheels, and moving parts. Accidents were common, and the consequences were often fatal. A worker's hand could easily be caught in a machine, resulting in horrific injuries, amputations, or even death. In some cases, the workers were simply expected to continue working, even if they were injured. Those who suffered severe injuries were left to their own devices, as there was little to no medical care available. The workers were considered dispensable, easily replaced if they were no longer able to perform their duties. The workday in Victorian factories was grueling, with many workers spending 12 to 16 hours a day, 6 days a week, on the factory floor. There was little time for rest, and breaks were rare and usually brief. The work itself was monotonous and exhausting, with workers performing the same repetitive tasks over and over again. For many, the work was physically demanding, and there was little opportunity for skill development or advancement. Workers were paid meager wages for their long hours, and many struggled to make ends meet, especially if they had families to support. Women and children, who were often employed in factories, suffered the most. In some cases, entire families worked in the same factory, with children as young as 5 or 6 being put to work alongside their parents. Women and children were seen as ideal workers because they could be paid less than men and were often subjected to even more oppressive conditions. Women typically worked in the textile mills, spinning cotton, weaving fabric, or operating the machines. They were expected to perform the same tasks as men, but for a fraction of the pay. Child labor was rampant, and children worked long hours in dangerous conditions, often operating machines that were far too large for their small bodies. Many children were forced to work in the factories instead of attending school, which perpetuated the cycle of poverty and ignorance. While the factory system was brutal for all workers, some industries were even more dangerous than others. The coal mines, for example, were notorious for their horrific conditions. Men, women, and children worked underground in dark, cramped tunnels with little to no light or ventilation. They were forced to work in the mines for long hours, carrying heavy loads of coal up and down narrow shafts. The work was physically demanding and dangerous, and many miners were killed in accidents or suffered from the long-term effects of working in the mines, such as respiratory diseases and lung cancer. The coal mines were particularly harsh on children, who were often used to crawl through narrow tunnels to reach areas where the coal could be extracted. These children were referred to as trappers because they were often tasked with opening and closing ventilation doors in the mines. The work was grueling and dangerous, and many children suffered severe injuries, including broken bones, burns, and lung diseases. They were paid a pittance for their work, and their lives were often cut short by the physical toll of the mines. For those who worked on the docks, conditions were similarly harsh. Dock workers, who unloaded cargo from ships, worked in dangerous conditions, often in the midst of sharp tools, heavy loads, and unstable platforms. The work was physically demanding and required workers to carry large, heavy sacks of goods in a hot, damp environment. Accidents on the docks were common, and injuries were frequent. Many workers fell into the water, where they risked drowning or being struck by the large vessels that moved in and out of the harbor. The docks were dangerous, not just because of the physical work, but because they were often a breeding ground for disease. The filth from the water, combined with the exposure to contaminated goods, made the docks an unhealthy place to work. In addition to the physical dangers, the work environment in Victorian London was also emotionally taxing. The work was often isolating, with workers spending long hours in dark, noisy factories or mines with little social interaction. Many workers suffered from depression, anxiety, and other mental health issues as a result of the constant strain and fatigue. The oppressive nature of the work, combined with the harsh living conditions and lack of opportunities for advancement, created a sense of hopelessness among many workers. There was no escape from the grind of factory life, and the feeling of being trapped in a system that valued profit over people was a constant source of stress for the working class. The inhumane work environment in Victorian London was a reflection of the city's industrial priorities. The factory system was built to maximize profit, with little regard for the welfare of workers. The conditions were dangerous, the hours were long, and the pay was inadequate. The people who worked in these factories, mines, and docks were treated as disposable commodities, their lives and health secondary to the demands of the economy. The working class, made up of men, women, and children, was forced to endure these conditions in order to survive. And for many, the toll of the work was irreversible. The factory system, which defined the Industrial Revolution in Victorian London, was an example of the extreme exploitation that occurred during this period, and it left a lasting mark on the city and its people. Victorian London was a city where danger lurked around every corner, and the risk of contracting a dangerous or even deadly disease was ever present. The lack of proper sanitation, overcrowded living conditions, and poor hygiene made the city an ideal breeding ground for infections and illnesses. The rapidly expanding population, combined with the industrialization of the city, meant that diseases spread quickly and unchecked, claiming the lives of thousands, if not more. In a city where survival was already a struggle, disease was another adversary that made life even more perilous for the working class. One of the most infamous diseases of the time was cholera, a bacterial infection that causes severe diarrhea and dehydration. Cholera outbreaks were a recurring problem in Victorian London, and the disease often struck with little warning. The city's water supply, contaminated by raw sewage, was the primary vector for cholera, and it spread rapidly through the crowded slums. The symptoms of cholera were brutal and quick, with victims often succumbing to dehydration and shock within a matter of hours. The disease was particularly deadly in poor areas, where access to clean water and proper medical care was limited. Cholera outbreaks were frequent, and each time they struck, the death toll was staggering. The city's authorities, slow to respond to the problem, failed to address the root causes of the disease, and it continued to devastate the population year after year. Another deadly disease that ravaged the streets of Victorian London was tuberculosis, or TB. Often referred to as consumption during this time, tuberculosis was a disease of the lungs that caused chronic cough, weight loss, and fatigue. The disease was highly contagious, spreading through the air when an infected person coughed or sneezed. In a city where overcrowded living conditions and poor ventilation were the norm, tuberculosis spread easily. It was particularly rampant in the working-class districts, where families lived in close quarters, and the constant exposure to dust, fumes, and pollutants in the factories worsened the condition of their already fragile lungs. TB was a slow killer, often taking years to claim its victim, and it was common for people to suffer from it for months or even years before dying. The disease was incurable at the time, and many died in the most harrowing ways, gasping for breath as their lungs filled with fluid. Smallpox was another disease that spread fear throughout the population. A viral infection, smallpox caused high fever, severe rashes, and in many cases, death. Those who survived were often left with disfiguring scars. Smallpox was particularly devastating in crowded and unsanitary environments, where the virus could spread quickly. Children were particularly vulnerable, and outbreaks of smallpox often led to widespread panic. The disease was highly contagious and spread through close contact, meaning that any gathering of people, such as in crowded slums or markets, was a potential hotspot for infection. Smallpox was so widespread in Victorian London that it was a major cause of death among the city's poor, with many people dying before they had a chance to receive any medical attention. Dysentery, another common and dangerous disease, was a major concern for the working-class poor in Victorian London. Caused by an infection of the intestines, dysentery led to severe diarrhea, dehydration, and in some cases, death. Like cholera, dysentery was closely tied to the city's lack of sanitation. Contaminated water, food, and living conditions allowed the bacteria to thrive, and people in the slums were particularly susceptible. Dysentery outbreaks often occurred after periods of heavy rainfall, when sewage from the streets would flood into the water supply, contaminating it with dangerous pathogens. Victims of dysentery would experience violent stomach cramps and diarrhea, and the disease could be fatal if left untreated. Medical care was scarce, and many people died from dehydration or the resulting complications. Scarlet fever, another devastating illness, also claimed the lives of many Victorian Londoners, particularly children. This bacterial infection caused a red rash, high fever, and sore throat, and it was highly contagious. The disease was more common among children in overcrowded neighborhoods, where poor nutrition and living conditions weakened their immune systems. Like many other diseases of the time, scarlet fever was treated poorly by medical practitioners, and many children died from complications such as pneumonia or heart failure. Even those who survived the disease were often left with long-lasting health problems, and the trauma of losing children to scarlet fever was all too common for families in Victorian London. The city's notorious fogs, which were the result of the heavy industrial pollution, also played a role in spreading disease. The fog, often referred to as London smog, was a thick, toxic mist created by the combination of coal smoke, industrial waste, and humidity. It blanketed the streets of London, making it difficult to see, breathe, or navigate. The smog had serious health implications for the city's inhabitants, particularly those who already suffered from respiratory diseases like tuberculosis or asthma. Inhaling the polluted air caused a range of health problems, including coughing, chest pains, and difficulty breathing. The fog also exacerbated the spread of infectious diseases, as it trapped germs and bacteria in the air, allowing them to circulate more freely. For those who worked in factories, the smog was an ever-present threat to their health, further increasing their risk of developing lung diseases. In addition to the well-known diseases, Victorian London was also plagued by various other infections and ailments that claimed the lives of the city's poor. Typhoid fever, for example, was another deadly disease that spread through contaminated food and water. Like cholera and dysentery, typhoid fever was closely tied to the city's unsanitary conditions. Infected water sources, often shared by entire neighborhoods, made it easy for the bacteria to spread. Typhoid fever caused high fever, abdominal pain, and weakness, and it could be fatal if not treated. Many of the city's poor, who had little access to medical care, were left to suffer from the disease without any hope of recovery. The lack of proper sanitation and health care meant that many diseases spread quickly and took hold in the city. The working class, who were already weakened by long hours in the factories, poor nutrition, and overcrowded living conditions, were particularly vulnerable. While the wealthy were able to afford medical care, the poor had little access to doctors or treatments. For most people in Victorian London, healthcare was a luxury that few could afford, and many had to rely on homemade remedies or traditional medicine to treat their illnesses. These remedies, often ineffective or even harmful, were no substitute for proper medical treatment, and many people died as a result. The poor health of the working class in Victorian London was a direct consequence of the social and economic inequalities that defined the era. The wealthy lived in relative comfort, with access to fresh water, clean air, and health care, while the poor were forced to endure squalid living conditions, overcrowding, and disease. The diseases that ravaged the working-class neighborhoods of London were not just the result of poor hygiene or a lack of medical knowledge. They were also the product of a system that valued profit over human life. The Industrial Revolution may have brought economic prosperity to some, but for many, it was a time of sickness, suffering, and premature death. The inability to effectively combat these diseases, combined with a disregard for the health and safety of the working class, led to a sense of hopelessness among many Londoners. Despite the relentless spread of disease, the city's authorities were slow to respond, and it wasn't until the latter part of the century that significant efforts were made to improve public health and sanitation. The introduction of clean water, the development of sewage systems, and the establishment of public health reforms helped reduce the prevalence of many of these diseases, but the damage had already been done. For those who lived and died in Victorian London, disease was an ever-present threat, one that loomed larger than the fog that shrouded the city streets. In Victorian London, one of the most fundamental and dangerous issues that plagued the city's population was the widespread lack of access to clean water. The situation was dire, particularly for the poor, who lived in overcrowded slums with no access to safe drinking water. The absence of sanitation and the failure of the authorities to address the problem meant that contaminated water was a constant threat to health, contributing to the spread of deadly diseases. This created an environment where the city's residents had to battle for survival. Water was a scarce and precious resource in Victorian London, and its quality was often appalling. At the time, the city's water supply was still in its infancy, a haphazard system that had yet to meet the needs of a rapidly growing population. The wealthier parts of the city were able to afford private wells or had access to filtered water, but for the vast majority of the working-class population, water was a commodity that had to be scrounged from unreliable, unclean sources. Without a proper infrastructure in place, people turned to the River Thames, which, despite being the city's main source of water, was heavily polluted. The Thames was a river that had become the lifeblood of the city, carrying water to households, mills, and industries. However, by the 19th century, the river had become a foul and toxic body of water, contaminated by sewage, industrial waste, and the byproducts of a growing city. Raw human waste was dumped directly into the river, along with refuse from factories, slaughterhouses, and workshops. The untreated waste mingled with the water, making it undrinkable and dangerous. For the poor living in the overcrowded slums, the river became their primary source of water, even though it was tainted with disease. This lack of access to clean water had devastating consequences. Cholera, dysentery, and typhoid fever spread rapidly through the population, carried by contaminated water. In times of heavy rainfall, the river would flood, carrying the filth from the streets into the homes of the poorest. The polluted water supply was often the only option for residents in the slums, leading to frequent outbreaks of waterborne diseases. The city's lack of a proper sewage system meant that waste was not carried away from homes, but instead built up on the streets, contributing further to the contamination of water sources. For those who could not afford to buy clean water, the situation was even worse. Public fountains and pumps were few and far between, and those that existed were often overcrowded and poorly maintained. People would gather in long lines to fill their buckets, and the water was often shared by multiple families. These public water sources, which were meant to alleviate the crisis, were no better than the polluted river. The water from these pumps was often dirty, and the rush of people trying to collect it made it even more contaminated. Families were forced to drink and cook with this filthy water, exposing themselves to a host of waterborne diseases. The lack of clean water also made it impossible for people to maintain proper hygiene. In an environment where basic sanitation was non-existent, personal hygiene became nearly impossible to maintain. Bathing was a luxury few could afford, and for many, washing hands or washing dishes became an afterthought. Without access to clean water, even the most basic form of cleanliness was unattainable. Poor hygiene, combined with the filthy water supply, exacerbated the spread of diseases. Cholera, in particular, spread quickly in these unsanitary conditions as the bacteria thrived in the polluted water. One of the most significant consequences of the lack of access to clean water was the high infant mortality rate in Victorian London. Babies, who were particularly vulnerable to waterborne diseases, were the most affected by the contaminated water. Families, often struggling to survive, relied on unsanitary water for baby formula or to clean their infants, contributing to the high death rates. For many working-class families, losing a child to a preventable disease was an all-too-common tragedy. The lack of clean water was a silent killer that took the lives of countless babies and young children. The wealthier classes, who lived in the more affluent parts of London, had the privilege of enjoying a safer water supply. They had access to private wells or were able to purchase clean water from delivery services that brought it directly to their homes. But for the poor, this was not an option. They had to rely on the same polluted water that ran through the streets, affecting their health and quality of life. The stark divide between the wealthy and the poor in Victorian London was starkly illustrated in the disparity in access to clean water. While the upper classes were protected from the deadly effects of contaminated water, the working-class poor were left to suffer the consequences of living in a polluted, unsanitary environment. The response from the authorities to this crisis was slow and inadequate. Despite the clear link between contaminated water and the spread of disease, it wasn't until the 1,850 that significant efforts were made to address the issue. The construction of a modern sewage system, spearheaded by engineer Joseph Bazalgette, was a turning point. Bazalgette's sewage system, which redirected waste away from the Thames, was a major step forward in improving the city's sanitation and water quality. However, this was a solution that came too late for many of the city's residents, who had already suffered from years of living with contaminated water. In the absence of modern plumbing, water was often collected from wells or public pumps. Wells were dug in backyards and in public spaces, but these were often shallow and prone to contamination. In many cases, the water was collected from wells that were too close to cesspits or privies, allowing sewage to seep into the water supply. This made the water dangerous to drink, and many people fell ill after consuming it. The public pumps, which were designed to provide clean water, were often contaminated by the same waste that polluted the wells. The lack of proper sanitation also contributed to the contamination of the water supply. In the poorer neighborhoods of London, waste was often disposed of in the streets or dumped into open pits, creating a constant source of contamination for the water supply. The streets were filled with refuse, and the filth was often washed into the water supply during rainstorms, further polluting the already contaminated water. The lack of clean water was not only a public health crisis, but also a social and political issue. It highlighted the deep inequalities that existed between the rich and the poor in Victorian London. The wealthy, who had access to clean water and better living conditions, were largely unaffected by the disease and suffering that plagued the poor. The working class, on the other hand, had to rely on contaminated water for their basic needs, exposing them to the dangers of disease and death. The fact that the authorities did little to address this issue for so long is a testament to the disregard for the lives of the poor in Victorian society. The lack of access to clean water in Victorian London was one of the most deadly and pervasive issues facing the city's working-class population. The polluted water supply, combined with poor sanitation and overcrowded living conditions, created a breeding ground for disease, leading to the deaths of thousands. While the wealthy had the luxury of access to clean water, the poor were forced to endure the consequences of a contaminated water supply that claimed lives and ruined health. It was a problem that lasted for decades and was only addressed in the latter part of the century. But by then, the damage had already been done. The lack of clean water was not just a public health crisis, it was a symptom of the larger social and economic inequalities that defined Victorian London. In the heart of the Industrial Revolution, when the city's factories and chimneys belched smoke into the sky, the gap between the wealthy elite and the struggling poor could not have been more pronounced. While those with wealth enjoyed rich, abundant meals, the poor lived in a world where food was scarce and often barely nutritious. For the working class, what little food they could afford was rarely enough to sustain them through the demands of their grueling labor. This scarcity was not just an inconvenience, it was a constant battle for survival. The poor were typically forced to rely on cheap, filling foods that provided little in the way of nutrition. Bread, often the only staple in their diet, was made from the cheapest, coarsest flour. While bread may have filled the stomach, it did little to nourish the body. The bread of the lower classes was dark and heavy, far removed from the lighter, fluffier loaves enjoyed by the wealthy. Some families even resorted to mixing bread with cheaper substitutes like barley or rye, making it dense and less nutritious. A diet dominated by bread left little room for the vitamins and proteins necessary for good health, leading to widespread malnutrition. Fresh vegetables, which could have provided some respite, were an expensive luxury beyond the reach of most working families. What vegetables could be found were often old and overripe, with poor quality produce being sold in the crowded markets at inflated prices. The lack of variety meant that many people had little more than potatoes, turnips, and occasionally onions. These vegetables, though filling, were low in essential nutrients. Inadequate access to fresh food left many Londoners severely lacking in vitamins and minerals, leading to stunted growth, weakened immune systems, and frequent illness. Meat, once an essential part of the diet for those with means, was rarely seen in the working-class household. For most, the idea of fresh meat was a distant dream. On the rare occasions when they could afford it, meat was often of the cheapest variety: tough cuts of beef, salted pork, or fish that had been dried or preserved. These meats were often riddled with salt and preservatives, offering little in terms of nourishment. The poor had to make do with what they could find: meat that was often spoiled, stale, or of questionable origin. A growing population meant that demand for food continued to outstrip supply, and food prices were often pushed beyond the means of the average worker. Even the simplest ingredients, like butter and milk, were luxuries that only the wealthy could enjoy. Milk, when available, was often watered down, and butter was a rare treat for families, sometimes reserved only for special occasions. Sugar, too, was a commodity that was largely inaccessible to the poor. It was too expensive for many families, and when it was available, it was often found in small quantities in the homes of the middle class or aristocrats. This scarcity of food often led to desperate measures. In some cases, the poor resorted to eating whatever they could find, including food that had spoiled or become contaminated. Street vendors and market stalls offered meat pies and fried foods, but the quality of the ingredients was often poor. The meat used in these pies was often unidentifiable, and the oil used for frying had been reused so many times that it had become rancid. While these offerings may have been cheap, they were also hazardous to health, contributing to the rise of food poisoning and other gastrointestinal diseases among the poor. For the working poor, food was not something to be enjoyed. It was a means to an end sustenance for survival. Many families struggled to get enough to eat, with some going entire days with only a small piece of bread or a meager bowl of soup. In the slums, it was not unusual for a family to share a single loaf of bread between them, stretching it out for as long as possible to ensure that no one went hungry. For many, hunger was a constant companion. Even when food was available, it was often insufficient to meet the demands of long hours of physical labor, and malnutrition became a widespread issue. The effects of food scarcity were felt in more than just physical health. Children, particularly, were severely impacted by poor nutrition. Many grew up underweight, stunted in height, and prone to illness. Malnutrition during childhood often resulted in lifelong health problems. Weak immune systems meant that diseases that might otherwise be survivable became deadly, and many children did not live to see adulthood. In a city where childhood was already fraught with dangers, the lack of proper nourishment made survival all the more uncertain. Despite the desperate conditions, the food crisis was met with little intervention from the authorities. Though the wealthy enjoyed abundance, the working poor had no such luxury. The government, while passing laws aimed at improving conditions for workers, did little to address the systemic issues of food scarcity. Without access to adequate nutrition, workers were left weak and vulnerable to disease, making it difficult to stand up to their employers or improve their living conditions. The combination of food scarcity, poor housing, and grueling work created an environment where the poor had little opportunity to escape their circumstances. In contrast, the rich enjoyed lavish meals and plentiful supplies. Their homes were stocked with fresh produce, meats, and fine wines, and their kitchens were tended by skilled servants who ensured that their meals were prepared to the highest standards. For the wealthy, food was a luxury, and it was easy to take it for granted. This stark divide between the lives of the rich and the poor reflected the broader inequalities that existed in society. While the wealthy dined on delicacies, the poor scraped by, subsisting on whatever scraps they could find. This disparity in access to food reinforced the class divisions that permeated Victorian society. While some measures were eventually taken to address the food crisis, such as the establishment of soup kitchens and food banks for the destitute, these were only temporary solutions. The real problem lay in the broader economic system that left so many people vulnerable to hunger. It was only later, in the 20th century, that more significant changes would be made to the food distribution system. But by then, the damage had been done. The effects of food scarcity and malnutrition had already taken a devastating toll on generations of poor Londoners. The story of food scarcity in Victorian London is not just a tale of hunger. It is a story of resilience in the face of overwhelming hardship. Despite the lack of proper nutrition, people found ways to survive. They learned to make do with what little they had, finding creative ways to stretch their food and make it last. But this did not come without a cost. The poor were forced to live in a constant state of deprivation, struggling not only to find food but to find enough of the right kind of food to maintain their health. For many, surviving the day was as much about holding on to hope as it was about finding their next meal. And even when food was scarce, their ability to endure it was a testament to the human spirit in the face of adversity. In the shadow of towering factories, where the smog-choked air threatened to suffocate, and the clanging of machines echoed through the streets, children were the unacknowledged backbone of the industrial age. Their tiny hands, though ill-suited to the brutal labor they were forced to endure, became an essential part of the machinery that powered the factories and mines of the growing empire. For many of these children, work was not a choice, it was a necessity, the only path to survival in a world where even the smallest could be swept away by the tide of poverty. Child labor during this era was not an anomaly. It was the norm. Children as young as 5 were routinely employed in dangerous, grueling conditions. The jobs they undertook were often physically demanding, mentally exhausting, and often resulted in permanent injury or even death. The sheer scale of this exploitation was staggering. It wasn't just 1 or 2 children per factory, it was entire generations of young lives spent toiling for a pittance. Factory work, especially in the textile mills, was among the most grueling forms of child labor. Children were seen as ideal workers for this industry. Their small hands could operate the delicate machinery with more agility than their adult counterparts. But this came at a cost. The mills were noisy, dark, and hazardous. The machines were enormous, their wheels and gears spinning at terrifying speeds. Children, often barefoot and in rags, were sent to work in this cacophonous, dangerous environment. The workday stretched long, sometimes up to 14 hours a day, 6 days a week, leaving these children no time for rest, play, or even basic education. The factories were no place for the innocent. The dangers that lurked within were as much a part of the job as the constant hum of the machines. The high-speed spinning wheels could easily catch a child's hair or clothing, pulling them into the machinery with terrifying speed. Many children were maimed in such accidents, their limbs crushed, their faces disfigured, and some were killed outright. The floors were slick with oil and debris, and the air thick with dust and fibers. Many children developed chronic respiratory problems from inhaling the toxic air day after day, their lungs slowly suffocating under the weight of the very air they needed to survive. The lives of children working in the coal mines were even more horrific. The work was backbreaking, and the conditions were so dangerous that even seasoned adults trembled at the thought of working there. Young children, some not much older than toddlers, were tasked with carrying coal from the mine to the surface. They were sent down into the dark, cramped tunnels to work alongside men who had spent their entire lives in these subterranean depths. The tunnels were so narrow that the children had to crawl on all fours to navigate through them, their backs hunched, their muscles straining under the weight of the coal they carried. The air in these mines was thick with smoke and dust, a toxic fog that clogged the lungs and made every breath a struggle. Many children developed the same debilitating lung conditions as the miners, suffering from chronic coughs, shortness of breath, and a constant sense of fatigue. But the most terrifying danger in the mines wasn't the poor air quality, it was the constant threat of cave-ins. Miners lived in constant fear of the earth caving in around them, of being crushed under the weight of tons of coal and rock. Children, with their small, fragile bodies, were often the first to perish in these disasters, buried beneath the rubble as their colleagues struggled to free them. Even those who worked in less physically demanding jobs, such as in the leather or glass factories, were still subjected to horrific conditions. The factory floors were often littered with shards of glass, sharp tools, and heavy machinery that required the strength of a fully grown adult to operate. Children were made to work in dangerous, unsanitary conditions, with little protection or training. In the leather factories, young workers were exposed to toxic chemicals that caused severe burns and long-term health problems. In the glass factories, children were tasked with handling glassware that was extremely hot to the touch, risking burns, cuts, and disfigurement with every step they took. These children, whose lives had barely begun, were forced into the most adult of responsibilities. They were deprived of their childhood, their health, and their potential for a better life. Instead of attending school or playing with their friends, they toiled in factories, earning a fraction of the wages an adult would receive for the same work. The meager pay they received was barely enough to keep their families afloat, and yet the need for survival meant they worked tirelessly, day after day, knowing that their only chance to eat or keep a roof over their heads was through this backbreaking labor. But it wasn't just the physical toll of the work that scarred these children. The mental and emotional toll was equally devastating. For many, the factory was not just a place of work, it was a prison. Children were often punished for the smallest mistakes, beaten for tardiness, or for falling behind in their duties. They were treated as nothing more than commodities, their lives valued only for the labor they provided. The idea of a child having a dream or a hope for a better future seemed absurd to those in power. The children were not seen as future generations to nurture, but as expendable resources to be used up and replaced as quickly as possible. The exploitation of children was further compounded by the fact that there was no legal protection for these young workers. Laws that would later be passed to limit child labor in the early 20th century did not exist. The only protection these children had was the charity or compassion of their employers, or the lack of it. In many cases, Factory owners saw their child workers as little more than disposable parts in the larger machinery of industry. Their health and well-being were of no concern, as long as they continued to churn out product after product for the factory's profits. As with many other aspects of life in this era, the suffering of children was often ignored by the upper classes. The factory owners, the politicians, and even many of the citizens of the time saw nothing wrong with children working in these conditions. They believed that the factory system was the natural order of things, that the poor had no other choice but to work, and that children, like adults, needed to contribute to the family's survival. The idea of childhood innocence, of children playing and learning, was a luxury that was out of reach for most families. For them, childhood was simply a prelude to the harsh realities of adulthood, and work was a rite of passage. It wasn't until later that social reformers and activists began to push for changes. Figures like Charles Dickens and Elizabeth Barrett Browning wrote about the horrors of child labor, giving a voice to the voiceless and drawing attention to the plight of these young workers. Gradually, the movement to protect children's rights gained momentum, and by the end of the century, laws were passed that restricted child labor and set minimum age requirements for factory work. But for those children who spent their formative years toiling away in factories, the damage was already done. Their bodies, minds, and spirits had been shattered by the brutality of their working conditions. Many grew up with physical disabilities, mental health issues, and a deep sense of despair. The hope for a better future that so many adults held on to was a distant dream for these children, one that was slowly crushed under the weight of their daily labor. In the end, child labor in the industrial age was a reflection of the darker side of progress. The rise of factories, technology, and wealth came at the cost of countless innocent lives, and the exploitation of children was one of the most tragic consequences of this period. The children who were forced into labor paid the price for the economic growth of the time, sacrificing their health, safety, and futures in the name of progress. The horrors of child labor, while eventually addressed through legal reforms, left an indelible mark on the history of industrial society. In the bustling, ever-expanding industrial cities, shelter was far from a guarantee, and for many, a permanent home was a distant dream. The struggle for a roof over one's head in this era was not just about securing a place to sleep, it was a daily battle against the cold, the filth, and the suffocating poverty that defined urban life. The growing population, driven by rural migration and the rapid rise of factory jobs, created a dire shortage of affordable housing, pushing the poor into squalid, overcrowded conditions. In the slums and back alleys of the industrial cities, living arrangements were often makeshift and temporary, yet they became the only option for countless families. Row upon row of cramped, dilapidated houses stretched through the city's poorest districts, offering little in the way of comfort or protection from the elements. These homes, known as back-to-back houses, were often little more than narrow, poorly constructed buildings that shared walls with other homes on either side, creating a maze of dark, dingy rooms. Many of these houses had no plumbing or sewage systems, and the inhabitants were forced to rely on communal water pumps and outdoor latrines. The sheer lack of space meant that entire families often had to share a single room, with parents, children, and sometimes even extended family members all crammed together in a confined space. The room served as a living area, a sleeping area, and sometimes even a place to eat and cook. Furniture, if it could be called that, was minimal, perhaps a rickety bed, a worn-out table, and a few chairs. These homes lacked privacy, warmth, and safety, and the oppressive atmosphere of overcrowding made it nearly impossible to find any sense of peace or comfort. The conditions were made worse by the constant presence of rats, fleas, and other vermin, which thrived in the filth and poor sanitation of these homes. Infestations were common, and many families had to endure the constant battle against pests that gnawed at their food, their belongings, and their bodies. The lack of cleanliness and proper hygiene, combined with the overcrowded conditions, led to the rapid spread of diseases, and the constant filth and disease created an environment where survival was a daily struggle. Many children grew up in these conditions, their health forever compromised by the lack of basic sanitation and the diseases that plagued the slums. These overcrowded homes were a breeding ground for illness. The close quarters, combined with the lack of fresh air and the constant dampness, created the perfect environment for diseases to spread quickly. Tuberculosis, cholera, typhoid, and dysentery were common, and the poor were often powerless to protect themselves from these diseases. The unsanitary conditions, along with the poor quality of food and water, meant that the most vulnerable children, the elderly, and the sick were the most likely to fall victim to illness. In many cases, entire families were wiped out by the same disease, and the constant fear of death hung over the slums like a dark cloud. The struggle for shelter was not limited to the poorest areas of the city. Even those who managed to find work in the factories often found themselves living in inadequate, cramped conditions. Workers who earned just enough to afford a roof over their heads still faced the harsh reality of overcrowding and poor quality housing. While they might have had a slightly better standard of living than the destitute, they were still at the mercy of an unforgiving housing market that offered little relief. Rent in these areas was high, and landlords, seeing the demand for shelter, often took advantage of the situation, charging exorbitant rents for homes that were barely fit for habitation. For the wealthy, the issue of housing was less of a struggle, but the growing poverty and squalor in the city slums were an undeniable concern. The divide between the rich and the poor was stark, and the working classes often had to look on from the gutters as the wealthy lived in large, grand homes in more desirable parts of the city. These homes, in contrast to the slums, were spacious, well-maintained, and far removed from the dirt and grime that defined the lives of the poor. The disparity in living conditions served as a reminder of the systemic inequality that defined industrial society. The scarcity of shelter also had a psychological impact on the poor. Many lived in constant fear of eviction, knowing that they had little to no legal rights as tenants. A missed rent payment, a quarrel with a landlord, or a simple change in circumstances could lead to them being cast out onto the streets. The uncertainty of having a permanent home weighed heavily on the minds of the poor, and the fear of homelessness was always present, lurking in the background. Even those who managed to scrape by were never certain that their shelter would remain secure. In response to these harsh realities, some social reformers and activists began to demand better housing for the working classes. Figures like the social critic and novelist Charles Dickens spoke out about the dire conditions faced by the poor, calling attention to the overcrowded and unsanitary living arrangements in the slums. Reform movements gained momentum, but change was slow. The government, though aware of the problem, was slow to act, and it took years of campaigning before laws were passed to improve housing standards. One of the first significant reforms came with the Housing of the Working Classes Act in 1885, which aimed to improve living conditions by providing affordable, sanitary housing for the working poor. The act allowed local authorities to clear slums and build new, better quality housing for the poor. Though the law was a step in the right direction, the scope of the reforms was limited, and many working-class families continued to live in inadequate housing long after the legislation was passed. The battle for shelter continued throughout the industrial era, and the fight for decent housing remained a central issue for the working classes. It wasn't until the 20th century that more comprehensive reforms were introduced, including the establishment of public housing and the development of new urban planning strategies. However, the scars of the housing struggle in the Victorian era remained, and the legacy of overcrowded slums and unsafe living conditions continued to shape the landscape of industrial cities for decades to come. In the end, the struggle for shelter in the industrial age was not just a fight for a roof over one's head, it was a battle for dignity, survival, and the basic right to live in a safe and healthy environment. The cramped, unsanitary conditions that so many endured were a testament to the inequality and neglect that marked the era. And for many, the battle for decent housing was one they would never fully win. In the world of industrialization and societal transformation, one of the most stark divides was the gendered one. The Victorians, in their rigidly defined social structures, held deeply ingrained beliefs about gender roles. These roles, which dictated how men and women were expected to behave, think, and contribute to society, were not only a reflection of cultural norms, but were entrenched in every facet of daily life. The gender divide shaped everything from family dynamics to career opportunities, and even the very streets people walked. For women, the Industrial Revolution brought both opportunity and further oppression. Yet their experiences were vastly different from the men who worked alongside them. For men, industrialization brought about a sense of empowerment, as factory work and skilled labor offered the chance for financial stability. As the male breadwinner, the man's role was clear: to provide, protect, and guide the family. The industrial workforce, with its increasing demand for workers, offered new job opportunities that allowed men to climb up the social ladder. Their work was seen as essential to the economy and to the modern world taking shape, and with that came both economic and social power. Men controlled the key industries and the wealth that flowed from them, often earning wages that placed them in the middle or upper classes, enabling them to shape the cultural and political direction of the time. Women, on the other hand, faced a completely different reality. The traditional Victorian ideal for women was that of the domestic angel. Women were expected to stay at home, raise children, and manage the household. The outside world was not for them. It was a place of danger, competition, and corruption. This view, known as the cult of domesticity, idealized women as pure, moral, and nurturing, essentially placing them on a pedestal within the private sphere of the home. Women were, in theory, protected from the harsh realities of the public world, but in practice, they were confined to it. Their social value was often measured by their ability to run a household efficiently, manage the moral upbringing of their children, and support their husbands without venturing into the public or professional spheres. However, the Industrial Revolution began to challenge this traditional notion of womanhood. With the increasing demand for labor in the factories, many women were forced to enter the workforce. Factory owners, eager to exploit cheaper labor, saw in women a source of inexpensive, docile workers. As a result, women began to work in large numbers in industries such as textiles, manufacturing, and even coal mining. Yet their entry into the workforce was not welcomed by everyone. In fact, the idea of women working in factories was deeply controversial. Critics argued that it corrupted the sanctity of womanhood, leaving women vulnerable to exploitation, physical harm, and moral decay. The types of work women were expected to do were heavily gendered. Women typically worked in roles that required less physical strength but more dexterity, such as weaving, sewing, or assembling delicate parts. In contrast, men were typically assigned jobs that involved more heavy lifting and skilled labor, such as operating machinery or working in construction. In many cases, women's jobs were poorly paid and exhausting, often involving long hours in difficult, unhealthy conditions. And while factory work offered women some economic independence, it also often meant that their earnings were far lower than those of their male counterparts. Women who worked in factories often earned half or even less than what men earned for the same amount of work, reinforcing the societal belief that women's labor was of lesser value than men. For middle and upper class women, the rise of industrialization meant that, while they were not forced to work in factories, they too were caught in the web of gendered expectations. The world outside the home was still seen as unsuitable for women, and their role was still considered to be within the domestic sphere. This created a cultural divide between those who worked in factories and those who managed households. Upper-class women were expected to focus on creating a respectable home, while men worked in the public world. Though women of wealth had more access to education and leisure, they were still largely excluded from professional life and political participation. Their main roles remained centered on maintaining the family's reputation and social standing, while men dominated professional fields, politics, and business. Yet, in the working-class families, women's roles extended beyond mere homemakers. Many women had to balance their domestic responsibilities with their factory jobs. This dual burden was grueling and left little room for self-care, education, or personal growth. Children, especially girls, were often forced to assist in the factories from a young age, as families struggled to survive in the face of grinding poverty. For working-class women, their lives were a constant struggle between making ends meet at work and fulfilling their duties at home. They faced the overwhelming challenge of trying to provide for their families while being subject to constant social and economic pressure. In these conditions, women's contributions to the family were seen as vital to its survival, yet were often ignored by society at large. The harsh realities of this divide were often exacerbated by the treatment of women in the workforce. Factory owners exploited women for their cheap labor, while societal views often painted them as morally inferior for working outside the home. The rise of industrial capitalism and the need for cheap labor encouraged the exploitation of young girls as well. The job market was flooded with young female workers, often no older than children, who worked in the same dangerous, unsanitary conditions as adults. These children were subjected to the same grueling hours and low wages, and were often forced to abandon their education in order to contribute to the family's income. The effects of industrialization on gender roles were not just economic, but psychological as well. Women working in the factories were often subjected to harsh conditions that took a toll on their physical and mental health. The monotonous, repetitive nature of factory work, combined with the long hours, left many women physically exhausted. But more than that, the dissonance between the ideals of womanhood and the harsh reality of factory labor created a profound sense of identity conflict. For many, the role they were expected to embody, that of the loving, moral mother and wife, did not align with their new identity as factory workers. This disconnect made them vulnerable to social stigma and internalized shame. The gender divide in the industrial world was also mirrored in the laws and social structures of the time. Women's rights were severely limited, and they were often excluded from political participation, education, and access to professional opportunities. Even the rights of married women were restricted. In marriage, a woman's legal status was subsumed under that of her husband, who had complete control over her property, earnings, and personal decisions. Women were expected to marry, have children, and fulfill their role in the home, but were discouraged from pursuing education, business, or careers. While there were some movements for women's rights during this time, they were often limited to middle-class women and lacked the broader social support that would come later with the suffragette movement. The belief that women's primary role was in the home made any deviation from this ideal seem radical and socially dangerous. As women slowly entered the public sphere, they were often met with resistance, both from men and from other women, who believed that industrial work and public involvement were corrupting forces that undermined womanhood. Despite these oppressive conditions, the industrial age also sparked significant change. The harsh realities of women's lives, particularly those in the working class, eventually gave rise to labor movements and feminist activism. Women began to demand better wages, safer working conditions, and access to education and employment opportunities. These movements, though initially met with resistance, began to challenge the established gender norms and gradually shifted the landscape of gender relations. In the long term, these movements helped pave the way for the slow but eventual dismantling of the gender divide that had so rigidly defined Victorian society. Women's contributions to the workforce, their fight for equality, and their advocacy for labor rights became critical aspects of the social and political landscape in the years to come. Yet, for many women in the industrial era, the gendered divide would continue to shape their lives long after the factory whistles stopped blowing. In the industrial cities of the Victorian era, the struggle against crime was a constant reality for both the poor and the wealthy. This was a time when society was rapidly transforming, where new technologies, growing populations, and widespread poverty led to a world filled with both opportunity and desperation. In the smog-filled streets, the divide between the rich and the poor was so sharp that it seemed almost inevitable that crime would be an ever-present shadow. The Industrial Revolution, though ushering in new economic possibilities, had also created a landscape rife with opportunity for crime to flourish. The working-class population was expanding exponentially as people flooded into cities in search of factory jobs. This surge in population put immense pressure on housing, sanitation, and local services, leaving many to live in overcrowded, dilapidated conditions. The poor, struggling to make ends meet, often turned to crime as a way to survive. Poverty-stricken families had little choice but to rely on theft, begging, and other illicit activities just to put food on the table. For many, crime wasn't a moral failing. It was an unfortunate necessity, a survival tactic in a society where opportunities for advancement were few and far between. At the same time, the wealthy were becoming more paranoid, retreating to their estates and increasing their security measures, fearing that the rising tide of criminal activity would inevitably encroach on their privileged lives. Crime, particularly theft, became more and more prevalent in the poorest parts of the city, and with the absence of comprehensive social programs and protections, it became clear that crime had to be combated head-on. The reality of Victorian crime was brutal, and it wasn't just a matter of petty theft. As the population grew and cities expanded, so did organized crime. Gangs began to form, some for survival, others for profit, and their operations became a daily feature of city life. These gangs controlled everything from street markets to entire neighborhoods, and their influence grew alongside the rise in poverty. These criminals weren't just opportunistic thieves. They were often part of larger networks, each with its own code, structure, and method of survival. One of the most notable criminal figures in the Victorian era was the notorious Jack the Ripper. His gruesome murders of women in the Whitechapel district of London during 1888 brought national and international attention to the state of crime in the city. Though the true identity of the Ripper remains a mystery, the murders revealed the deep sense of fear and mistrust that had begun to fester in the working-class areas of London. The Ripper's crimes were not just about murder, they were symbolic of the broader societal collapse. For the impoverished women of Whitechapel, who worked as prostitutes and lived in abject conditions, crime was a constant presence. The terror that gripped these women wasn't just a result of the Ripper. It was an indictment of the systemic failures that left them vulnerable in the first place. As the poor turned to crime for survival, so too did they become the primary victims of crime. Theft, assaults, and domestic violence were common in the slums, and they were often ignored or underreported. For those in power, the issue of crime was more about controlling the lower classes than addressing the root causes. The police force, formed in the early part of the 19th century, was overwhelmed by the scale of crime. Though their presence in the streets grew, their methods were often outdated, and their focus was on keeping order rather than addressing the causes of criminal activity. The constables and detectives were often seen as a force to maintain the status quo, and the working classes didn't always view them as allies in their struggle for survival. In addition to the widespread crime, the Victorian era was also defined by its judicial system, which dealt harshly with those found guilty of criminal activity. In the mid-19th century, the penal system was notorious for its brutal treatment of prisoners. Convicted criminals, particularly those from the lower classes, were often sentenced to hard labor, solitary confinement, or transportation to the colonies. Prisons were overcrowded, filthy, and inhumane, with little effort made to rehabilitate offenders. Many individuals, particularly those who had committed minor crimes out of desperation, would find themselves in the penal system, where they would often emerge more hardened and more entrenched in a life of crime than when they had entered. The long-term consequences of this criminal justice approach were profound. Those who were convicted of a crime were often branded for life, their opportunities for reintegration into society severely limited. Former convicts were shunned, with little opportunity to regain their status or seek work. This harsh system not only failed to address the root causes of crime, but perpetuated the cycle of poverty and criminality for generations. This punitive approach highlighted the failure of the Victorian society to deal with the underlying causes of crime, poverty, inequality, and lack of education. and instead focused on punishment as the solution. While the lower classes were plagued by crime, the upper classes were not immune either. Though their homes and neighborhoods were protected by the police, the rich were constantly worried about the growing unrest in the slums. Wealthy Londoners often faced the threat of pickpockets, burglars, and even violent assaults in their attempts to protect their property. As a result, they employed private security and were quick to call the police in any instance of suspected criminal activity. This only deepened the divide between the rich and poor, with the wealthiest able to shield themselves from the crimes that affected the majority of the population. The fear of crime also fed into the moral panic surrounding certain aspects of society, particularly prostitution. As the population swelled, many women found themselves pushed into prostitution as a way to survive. The squalid conditions of the brothels and the exploitation of women in the sex trade were among the most visible symbols of the rampant poverty and crime. The criminalization of prostitution led to a further victimization of women who were often left without any other means of support. Instead of addressing the systemic issues that led to women turning to prostitution, Victorian society preferred to criminalize and marginalize them. Police raids, moral campaigns, and arrests became a routine part of life in the slums, and these women were often caught in the crossfire. As the 19th century drew to a close, reform movements began to emerge, calling for better housing, improved working conditions, and fairer treatment for the poor. Organizations like the Salvation Army and other social welfare groups sought to address the root causes of crime by providing education, housing, and job opportunities. But even as the reform movement gained momentum, the underlying issues, poverty, class inequality, and lack of education remained largely unaddressed. The gap between the rich and poor only deepened, and the criminal divide continued to shape Victorian society in profound ways. The never-ending struggle against crime in the Victorian era was a reflection of a much larger social and economic divide. For the poor, crime wasn't just a part of life, it was a matter of survival. The lack of social mobility, the oppressive working conditions, and the brutal living environments meant that crime became the only avenue through which many could navigate the harshness of their existence. For the wealthy, crime was a reminder of the social unrest simmering just beneath the surface, and they turned to law enforcement to protect themselves. Yet, in the end, the system failed to address the root causes of crime, perpetuating a cycle of violence, poverty, and punishment. The crime in Victorian society wasn't just a reflection of moral decay, it was a symptom of a much deeper problem. The failure of society to care for its most vulnerable members. The poor law and the workhouses stand as one of the most haunting features of the Victorian social landscape, emblematic of the stark divide between the rich and the poor during a time of profound societal and industrial change. In a world where the poor were largely invisible to the more affluent, the poor law was designed to manage, control, and, in some cases, penalize those in need. It was an attempt by the government to deal with the issue of poverty that ignored its deeper causes, inequality, industrial exploitation, and social division, by creating a system that often made life even harder for the poorest. By the 1832, the poverty and overcrowding in rapidly growing urban areas like London had reached critical levels. The Industrial Revolution had drawn millions of people to the cities in search of work. But for many, the reality of factory work was worse than expected. Wages were low, hours were long, and conditions were dangerous. The poor, who had no access to adequate education, health care, or employment opportunities, were left to survive in the streets, alleyways, and overcrowded slums. The middle and upper classes, who had benefited from industrial growth, were increasingly concerned about the rising numbers of the poor. The specter of mass unemployment, combined with the growing influence of socialist ideologies, made poverty seem not just a social problem, but a political one. The response from the government came in the form of the New Poor Law of 1834. This legislation was designed to prevent the spread of what was deemed the pauper class, by making the conditions for receiving poor relief so harsh that only the truly desperate would seek help. The principle of less eligibility became central to the system. The idea that life in the workhouse should be worse than life outside it, ensuring that only those who had no other choice would seek refuge in these institutions. This policy marked a dramatic shift from the previous system of poor relief. Prior to 1834, the local parish was responsible for providing aid to the poor in the form of outdoor relief, financial assistance, food, or even clothing, often granted to individuals in their own homes. However, with the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834, outdoor relief was largely abolished. Instead, the poor were expected to enter the workhouses, which were intended to provide shelter and food in exchange for labor. In the eyes of the government, this approach was designed to discourage dependence on the state and to encourage self-sufficiency. Though it failed to account for the systemic issues that kept people in poverty, workhouses were intended to be harsh environments that stripped individuals of their dignity and independence. They were designed to be places where men, women, and children could be reformed through the hardest of work and strict rules. The idea was that the workhouse would teach poor people a lesson in discipline, hard work, and personal responsibility, essentially turning them into productive members of society. However, in practice, the workhouses became sites of deprivation, suffering, and abuse, rather than spaces for rehabilitation. The conditions inside the workhouses were abysmal. The buildings themselves were often large, austere, and cold, designed not for comfort, but for control. The workhouse was divided into separate areas for men, women, and children, often with harsh rules governing the movement and interaction of the inhabitants. The men might be put to work breaking stones, picking oakum, separating fibers from rope, or performing menial tasks like cleaning or maintenance, while the women were tasked with more domestic labor, such as laundry and sewing. Children, often separated from their parents, might be forced into the same harsh routines, working long hours in the same grueling conditions. Inside the workhouse, the rules were rigid and dehumanizing. The poor were stripped of their autonomy, subjected to a system that punished them for their poverty, rather than addressing the underlying causes. Discipline was harsh, with punishment for any disobedience or failure to work. Food was basic, often just a thin gruel or stale bread, and any comforts were deliberately withheld. The poor were forced to work long hours for minimal food, and living conditions were deliberately kept unpleasant to deter anyone from seeking help unless absolutely necessary. The workhouses were also steeped in moral judgment. The poor were not only required to work, but to prove their worthiness for relief. They had to endure demeaning procedures such as interviews to prove that they were deserving of charity. In many cases, applicants were forced to enter the workhouse and live under its oppressive conditions for long periods of time before being allowed to receive any assistance. The stigmatization of the poor was an integral part of the system. If you were poor, you were presumed to be morally flawed or lazy, and the workhouse served as a harsh reminder of your failure. One of the most tragic and disturbing aspects of the workhouse system was the treatment of women and children. Female inmates were often subjected to grueling labor that kept them away from their families and children, while children were often separated from their parents altogether. In some cases, children were sent to different workhouses entirely, where they were subjected to long hours of labor, poor food, and limited education. Many of these children never had the chance to grow up in a family environment, instead growing up in an institutionalized setting where their every move was monitored and controlled. The goal was to instill discipline in these children, but what was often instilled was a sense of hopelessness, fear, and powerlessness. While the workhouse system was intended to deter reliance on state support, it did not address the root causes of poverty, wage inequality, lack of education, and the absence of social safety nets. As a result, many who entered the workhouses never left, finding themselves trapped in a cycle of poverty, poor health, and lack of opportunity. And for those who did manage to escape, the stigma of being an inmate followed them for the rest of their lives, marking them as people who had failed. not because they were lazy or morally corrupt, but because they had no other option. In addition to the physical and emotional toll, the workhouses were also a breeding ground for disease. With overcrowding, poor ventilation, and inadequate sanitation, the spread of infectious diseases was rampant. Cholera, tuberculosis, and typhoid fever were common inside the workhouses, and many people, especially children, died from preventable diseases. The lack of proper medical care, coupled with the harsh living conditions, meant that the workhouses became not only a place of punishment, but also a death sentence for many of their inhabitants. Despite the cruelty of the system, there was little opposition to the poor law and the workhouses for many years. The government, concerned with maintaining order and keeping the poor from revolting, saw the system as a necessary tool for social control. The middle and upper classes, who had the power to shape public opinion, generally supported the workhouse system, believing that the poor needed to be disciplined. The workhouses were a fair way to provide them with shelter and food without encouraging dependence on charity. However, as the years went on and the abuses of the system became more widely known, the workhouses started to come under increasing scrutiny. The system was criticized for its failure to address the real causes of poverty and for its inhumane treatment of the poor. Reformers and social activists began to push for better conditions, including better access to food, education, and healthcare for the poor. The emergence of the welfare state in the 20th century, as well as the expansion of social services, eventually led to the demise of the workhouse system. However, for many Victorians, the damage had already been done. The workhouses had become a symbol of the Victorian approach to poverty, punitive, judgmental, and deeply dehumanizing. The poor law and workhouse system of the Victorian era remains a powerful reminder of how society dealt with its most vulnerable citizens. Instead of offering compassion, education, or real opportunities, the system punished the poor for their circumstances, reinforcing the divide between the rich and the poor, and perpetuating a cycle of suffering and despair. The legacy of the workhouse system endures as a stark example of what happens when society chooses control and discipline over compassion and social support. In Victorian cities, fire was a constant and looming threat, especially in the rapidly expanding urban centers, where overcrowding, inadequate infrastructure, and a lack of modern firefighting systems made fire disasters almost inevitable. The constant threat of fire hung over the poor and working classes who lived in tightly packed tenements and slums where a single spark could destroy entire neighborhoods, killing people, animals, and reducing homes to ashes. For the lower classes, this wasn't just a theoretical threat. It was a very real and daily concern that shaped the way they lived, worked, and even slept. Victorian cities, particularly London, were largely constructed using timber, which, though a traditional building material, was highly flammable. Many buildings were hastily erected to accommodate the swelling populations brought about by the Industrial Revolution. These buildings, often constructed with cheap materials, were ill-equipped to prevent fires, and the internal infrastructure, such as narrow streets, faulty wiring, and crowded, poorly ventilated spaces, only worsened the risk. In poorer districts, people often cooked their meals over open flames, with little more than a few stone walls separating them from the next house. The absence of adequate fire safety measures meant that if a fire started, it could spread rapidly, consuming whole blocks before help arrived. In fact, it wasn't just a matter of poor building practices. The rapidly growing urban population created a dynamic where people were more closely packed together than ever before. This had several implications. There were more people to potentially start a fire, more people at risk of being caught in one, and more limited resources to put out the flames. In a densely populated area with poorly maintained roads and buildings, firefighting efforts were often ineffective. Firemen were often poorly trained, underfunded, and overwhelmed by the scale of the problem. The city's fire brigades, if they existed at all, were more concerned with protecting the property of the wealthy, leaving the poor to fend for themselves in the face of disaster. The danger of fire was particularly acute in the slums where the poorest members of society lived. In these areas, multiple families often crowded into single rooms, and many families had to rely on a single fireplace to heat their homes and cook their food. In these conditions, even a small mistake such as an ember falling onto the floor or a careless neighbor leaving a candle burning could easily ignite a fire that would consume everything in its path. And once the fire started, it was incredibly difficult to stop. In many of the city's worst neighborhoods, the streets were so narrow that fire engines couldn't even fit through. The lack of a reliable water supply made it even harder to put out fires. Water pipes, when they existed at all, were often too old or clogged to provide a steady stream. In the absence of professional fire services, much of the firefighting was left to the residents themselves, who often lacked the training or equipment to make a real difference. One of the most notorious fires in Victorian London history was the Great Fire of 1834, which destroyed much of the Houses of Parliament and devastated parts of Westminster. Though not the worst disaster in terms of casualties, the fire was emblematic of the broader risk of fire in the city. The fire spread rapidly due to the close proximity of the buildings, poor construction, and the fact that much of the city was built from wood. The fire highlighted the inadequacies of the firefighting services at the time. Though the fire brigades eventually managed to control the flames, it was too late to save the majority of the buildings. This fire was a wake-up call for the authorities, who began to realize that stronger measures needed to be taken to prevent fire outbreaks. However, even after the Great Fire, the risk of fire remained high. In the Victorian era, fires were common in industrial sites as well. Factories, many of which operated with coal-powered machinery, were rife with fire hazards. The lack of proper safety protocols combined with the long working hours, the hazardous materials being used, and the cramped and poorly maintained workspaces meant that a spark or an accident could easily lead to a fire that could injure or kill factory workers. In fact, many factory fires were deadly because the workers were often locked inside, unable to escape in time. The narrow exits, lack of proper fire drills, and poor lighting in these factories made it nearly impossible for workers to evacuate when disaster struck. But the fire risk wasn't just restricted to factories and poor housing. The growing popularity of gas lighting in Victorian cities brought with it a new set of fire hazards. Gas lamps, though more efficient than candles or oil lamps, were far from foolproof. They were prone to leaks, and an errant spark could ignite a devastating fire. There were instances of entire city blocks being set alight due to gas leaks, and the damage caused by such fires was compounded by the difficulty in putting them out. The introduction of gas lighting made it possible to light more of the streets, but it also contributed to a fire-prone environment. Many fires in the Victorian era were small, spontaneous, and caused by accidents. But the true tragedy often came when these fires turned into major disasters. The aftermath of such fires was horrific, particularly for the families who lived in the poorer districts. Not only were their homes destroyed, but they were often left with nothing, forced to rebuild their lives from scratch. For the poor, there was no safety net, no insurance, no means of recovering what had been lost. Many families were left homeless, wandering the streets in search of shelter. The devastation from a fire wasn't just the immediate damage, it was the long-term consequences of losing everything in one catastrophic moment. In response to the constant threat of fire, some members of the Victorian community took it upon themselves to protect their own interests. Wealthy homeowners who had the resources began to invest in fireproofing their buildings, installing advanced fireproof doors, and hiring private firefighters to protect their properties. These wealthier areas often had more resources to deal with the problem of fire, but the poor were left largely unprotected. In these areas, there was little incentive for the authorities to act. The poor were left to fend for themselves, and the city's fire brigades focused their attention on more valuable areas, ensuring that the properties of the upper class were protected, while the poor were often left to face the dangers of fire on their own. The government did eventually recognize the scale of the fire problem, and several reforms were introduced throughout the 19th century. Building codes were established that mandated fire-resistant materials and better construction practices. Firefighting services were improved, and fire insurance became more widely available. However, these reforms didn't come soon enough for the countless individuals and families who had already lost everything in fires. Even with these reforms, the threat of fire continued to hover over the Victorian cities, particularly in the poorest neighborhoods, where the risks of fire remained ever present. The constant threat of fire in the Victorian era was a reflection of the broader inequalities and risks that the poor faced in their daily lives. Fires weren't just about the immediate destruction they caused, but the larger implications of how they exacerbated the struggles of the impoverished. For many, survival was not only about avoiding the flames, but finding a way to rebuild after the damage had been done. The poor in Victorian society faced a perpetual state of vulnerability, where every aspect of their lives, be it work, housing, or basic survival, carried with it the risk of catastrophe. The constant fear of fire was just one of the many hardships that defined life for the poor in Victorian times. It serves as a chilling reminder of how the most basic human need, safety, was often denied to those who needed it the most. The streets of Victorian cities, particularly London, were a far cry from the well-manicured, orderly image often painted by more romanticized depictions of the era. The reality for most people living in the dense, smoke-filled neighborhoods was far less picturesque. Crime was rampant, and the threat of violence was ever present. For the poor, the streets were as dangerous as they were unpredictable, with crime lurking in every alley and corner, from petty thefts to violent assaults, muggings, and even murder. For those without resources, social safety nets, or even a place to sleep, the streets themselves became a battleground, where survival often depended on one's ability to navigate the dangers lurking in the shadows. The chaotic nature of urban life during the Victorian era, shaped by rapid industrialization, social upheaval, and mass migration from rural areas to cities, contributed to the proliferation of crime. The rise of the working class and the growing number of impoverished people who filled the streets created a breeding ground for criminal activity. The disparity between the wealth of the upper classes and the grinding poverty of the lower classes fueled discontent and frustration. For many, crime became not just a necessity, but a way of life, as it offered a way to survive in an increasingly hostile world. As cities expanded, the streets became overcrowded, with many of the poorest individuals forced to live in unsanitary, overcrowded tenements. These areas, often made up of narrow, poorly lit alleyways and cramped housing, were prime locations for criminals to operate undetected. The lack of basic infrastructure and public services exacerbated the problem. With no effective policing in place, crime flourished in the slums, and those who lived in these conditions had little choice but to accept it as a fact of life. The police, if they were present at all, often had little authority or presence in these areas. The sheer size of the city, combined with its lack of law enforcement, meant that criminals could operate with impunity. The Victorian era saw the emergence of many different types of crime, from theft to assault to more organized criminal activities. The most common form of crime was petty theft. Pickpocketing, shoplifting, and other forms of theft were widespread, particularly in the poorer districts, where desperation and hunger made stealing a matter of survival. Street urchins and beggars, many of whom were abandoned children or orphans, were particularly vulnerable to becoming involved in petty crime. The lack of any meaningful employment opportunities for these children made it easy for them to fall into a life of crime, particularly pickpocketing and theft, which became ingrained in the street culture of Victorian London. For adults, crime often meant taking part in violent acts such as muggings, robberies, or worse. The streets of London were filled with criminals who would resort to violence as a means of survival, often armed with knives, clubs, or even guns. The victim was often an easy target, someone alone, vulnerable, and unaware of the dangers around them. Thieves would lurk in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. and the victims often had little recourse. Even in daylight, the streets could be dangerous. Muggings, where people were physically attacked and robbed, were common in the more rundown parts of the city. Many victims were left to fend for themselves, often without any assistance from the authorities. Perhaps the most notorious criminal figures in Victorian cities were the gangs that terrorized the poorer districts. Organized crime became a growing issue as people from all walks of life formed criminal groups to prey on the city's most vulnerable. These gangs operated in the slums and often controlled entire neighborhoods. They would extort money from businesses, engage in street fights, and intimidate the general population. Some of the most infamous gangs, like the notorious Bowery Boys or the Peaky Blinders, used violence and terror to assert control over their territories. These criminal organizations often recruited young people, particularly orphans and those with no other prospects, into their ranks. These young recruits were often trained to be ruthless and violent, and many ended up committing heinous acts on the streets under the orders of gang leaders. The influence of these gangs spread far beyond just the streets, with many of their activities reaching into local politics and law enforcement. For women, crime on the streets of Victorian London took on a particularly dangerous form. Prostitution was widespread, particularly in the more destitute areas of the city. Many women were forced into this line of work because of poverty, lack of employment opportunities, or personal circumstances. The so-called fallen women lived in constant fear of violence and exploitation. Not only were they at risk of being physically assaulted by their clients, but they also faced the constant threat of arrest or eviction. Women who worked as prostitutes often had no choice but to accept the conditions they were given, as they had few other options for survival. The worst part of this widespread criminal activity was that it was often ignored by the police and the authorities. Victorians, especially those from wealthier classes, often turned a blind eye to the plight of the poor, dismissing their crimes as the unfortunate byproduct of poverty. Crime, particularly petty theft and prostitution, was often seen as a moral failing rather than the result of systemic inequality. Victims of crime from the lower classes were rarely given the same attention as those from wealthier backgrounds. For the poor, the authorities were often seen as more interested in maintaining order for the benefit of the rich than in serving or protecting the disadvantaged. The police, though growing in number and function during the 19th century, were understaffed, poorly trained, and lacked the resources needed to effectively fight crime in the poorer districts. Their presence in these areas was minimal, and when they did intervene, their actions were often more focused on punishing the poor for their crimes rather than addressing the root causes of criminality, like poverty, lack of education, and poor living conditions. In response to this rising tide of crime, the government took several steps to improve law enforcement, but many of these were aimed at curbing crime among the poor rather than addressing the conditions that made crime inevitable. More police officers were stationed in the streets, and the formation of the Metropolitan Police in 1829 marked the beginning of a more organized approach to crime control in London. However, the police force was often overwhelmed by the sheer number of crimes, and their work was made more difficult by the often hostile and suspicious attitude of the working class. They saw them as instruments of control rather than protectors. In fact, the police force itself was not free from corruption, bribery, political interference, and a lack of accountability meant that even those in positions of authority often contributed to the criminal activities that plagued the city. Yet, despite the constant threat of crime and the overwhelming challenges facing the poor, many found ways to resist. Communities banded together to protect each other, with neighbors forming informal neighborhood watch systems to look out for one another. Workers' unions began to organize, fighting for better wages, better working conditions, and an end to the criminalization of the poor. While crime continued to thrive in the shadows, many in the poorer classes began to push back, demanding that their voices be heard, and that the systemic inequalities that fueled crime be addressed. In a city where crime was often seen as a way of life, the dangerous streets of Victorian London remained an enduring symbol of the inequities of the era. The poor, trapped in a system that denied them opportunities and access to basic rights, were often left to survive by any means necessary. For them, crime was not just a matter of survival, it was a product of a society that had failed to provide for its most vulnerable. The dangerous streets were both a literal and metaphorical reflection of the class divides that defined the era. And for those who walked them every day, crime was an ever-present and ever-lurking threat. Health and hygiene in Victorian cities were a constant battle, particularly for the working class. The Industrial Revolution, with all its technological advances, brought about massive urbanization. Cities like London swelled in population as people flocked from rural areas in search of work in factories. But the rapid growth of these cities was not matched by improvements in public health. Instead, the streets became overcrowded, sanitation systems were inadequate, and diseases spread like wildfire, devastating entire neighborhoods. The struggle for health and hygiene was a grim reality for most people, and surviving the poor conditions often meant living with chronic illnesses, poor nutrition, and a constant risk of disease. One of the most glaring issues during this time was the lack of proper sanitation. In the poorest neighborhoods, sanitation was practically non-existent. The streets were often clogged with refuse, and there were no proper waste disposal systems in place. People would throw their household waste out into the streets, and it was common for filth to accumulate in alleys and around homes. The smell was unbearable, and it became part of daily life for the poor. Open sewers ran through the streets, carrying human waste and industrial runoff, creating a breeding ground for bacteria and disease. For the working-class families living in these conditions, it was not unusual for waste to spill into their homes, as houses were overcrowded and many didn't have private facilities. The lack of hygiene was one of the major factors contributing to the rampant spread of disease. The government's initial response to this problem was minimal. While there were some public health acts passed during the century, they were largely ineffective due to lack of funding and political will. The sanitary conditions in cities like London were dire, and in many areas, the local authorities had little interest in tackling the issues. It wasn't until the mid-1800s that the issue of sanitation was taken seriously, largely due to the efforts of public health reformers like Edwin Chadwick. Chadwick's reports on the dire conditions in London led to the eventual passing of the Public Health Act in 1848, but by then, the damage had already been done. For most of the century, the poor were left to fend for themselves in the face of disease and filth. One of the most terrifying diseases to strike during the Victorian era was cholera. The first major cholera outbreak in London occurred in 1831, and the disease would strike again in 1848, 1854, and 1866. Cholera was a waterborne disease, transmitted through contaminated drinking water, and the lack of proper sanitation made it a perfect storm for its spread. Cholera outbreaks often killed hundreds, if not thousands, in a single wave. The symptoms of cholera, violent vomiting, diarrhea, and dehydration, could lead to death within hours. The outbreaks were so severe that entire neighborhoods were wiped out in just a matter of days, and the disease spread quickly due to the contamination of the city's water supply. In 1854, Dr. John Snow, a physician and pioneering epidemiologist, made a groundbreaking discovery about the spread of cholera. By mapping the locations of cholera cases in Soho, London, he was able to trace the source of the outbreak to a contaminated water pump on Broad Street. His work led to the realization that clean water and proper sewage systems were vital to preventing the spread of disease. This discovery would ultimately lead to improvements in public health and the development of modern sanitation systems, but it came too late for the thousands who had already perished. Typhoid fever, tuberculosis, and diphtheria were also rampant in Victorian cities, all of which thrived in the overcrowded, unsanitary conditions of the slums. Tuberculosis in particular was one of the most deadly diseases of the time, known as consumption, because of the gradual wasting away of the body. It was often contracted through the inhalation of bacteria from infected individuals' coughs and sneezes. The disease spread easily in cramped conditions, where people lived in close quarters and often had little access to fresh air or sunlight. Many workers in factories were particularly vulnerable to respiratory diseases due to the pollutants in the air. Dust, soot, and chemicals from factories filled the air, and without proper ventilation, people worked in toxic environments that further compromised their health. In addition to these diseases, there was the constant presence of infectious diseases like scarlet fever, smallpox, and measles, which were prevalent among children. These diseases would sweep through impoverished neighborhoods, where access to medical care and vaccinations was limited. It was not unusual for entire families to fall ill with the same disease, and in many cases, entire families were wiped out by these illnesses. Children, especially those from the poorest backgrounds, were particularly at risk. Their bodies, weakened by malnutrition and poor living conditions, were less able to fight off infections, making them more susceptible to fatal diseases. The lack of proper medical care was another major factor contributing to the poor health of the working class. Doctors were few and far between in poor neighborhoods, and many could not afford to seek treatment. Instead, they turned to home remedies and folk cures, often with little to no success. The medical profession at the time was still in its infancy, and many of the treatments used were rudimentary at best. Bloodletting, for example, was still a common practice despite its proven ineffectiveness. The lack of knowledge about hygiene and sterilization meant that hospitals were often filthy, and many patients contracted infections simply by entering a medical facility. However, even those who could afford a doctor were not always guaranteed the best care. Doctors in the Victorian era lacked the knowledge and technology that we take for granted today. There were no antibiotics, no understanding of germs, and no vaccines to protect against disease. Surgery was often performed without anesthesia, and many doctors relied on old, ineffective treatments to treat their patients. The lack of sanitation in medical facilities meant that infections were common, and the use of unsterilized instruments made it easy for diseases to spread. Even the most basic treatments, such as tooth extractions, could result in death due to infections. For those living in the slums, the situation was particularly dire. The streets were filled with garbage, and many homes had no running water or sewage systems. In many cases, people were forced to use the same water for drinking, cooking, and washing, further spreading disease. The lack of access to clean water meant that people had to rely on public pumps, which were often contaminated, or they had to drink from the polluted rivers that ran through the city. Even basic hygiene, such as washing hands or bathing, was a luxury that many could not afford. Soap was expensive, and many people simply didn't have the means to keep themselves clean. This led to the spread of lice, fleas, and other parasites, which further contributed to the poor health of the population. Despite the overwhelming challenges posed by poor health and hygiene, there were some efforts to improve conditions during the Victorian era. Reformers like Florence Nightingale and Joseph Lister brought attention to the importance of sanitation in hospitals, and their work helped lay the foundation for modern medical practices. The Public Health Act of 1848 and subsequent acts aimed to improve sanitation in cities, but these reforms came too late for many who had already suffered from disease and poor living conditions. In the end, the struggle for health and hygiene in Victorian cities was a daily battle for the poor. Disease, poor sanitation, and lack of medical care made life incredibly difficult, and survival often depended on sheer luck. Those who lived in the slums were forced to contend with overcrowded housing, contaminated water, and a constant threat of disease. For many, the battle for health was a battle they would lose, often dying young from diseases that could have been prevented with better living conditions and access to medical care. The Victorian era, while a time of great progress in many areas, was also a time of great suffering for the working class, who faced a constant struggle to stay alive in the face of unrelenting disease and poor health. In the midst of all the hardships, the individuals who lived in these grueling conditions were far more resilient than we often give them credit for. Despite the constant threats to their health, safety, and well-being, they managed to survive and, in many cases, even thrive in their own ways. The streets of Victorian London may have been filled with dangers, crime, disease, poverty, but it was also a place where humanity's perseverance shone through. Families supported each other, neighbors shared what little they had, and even in the darkest moments, there were sparks of kindness, humor, and hope. For them, survival wasn't just about enduring the challenges. They had to find ways to live, love, and laugh in spite of it all. In many ways, their resilience laid the foundation for the society that would rise from the soot and the fog, a testament to the human spirit's ability to endure even the harshest of environments. As we reflect on their stories, it's important to remember that the struggles of the past weren't just about survival. They were about the fight for a better life, a fairer world. Though the streets were a battleground for survival, they were also a place where change began. Every protest, every small act of defiance against the grim realities of life in Victorian London, played a part in shaping the world we live in today. The lessons of the past are important. The suffering of the working class during the Victorian era reminds us of the importance of equality, the need for accessible healthcare, and the fight for social justice. Today, as we enjoy the comforts and advancements that those who came before us fought for, it's essential to acknowledge and honor their struggles. If this video has resonated with you, please don't forget to like, share, and comment below with your thoughts. I'd love to hear from you about what you found most striking about the history of Victorian London and how it shapes our understanding of the world today. If you haven't already, subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the fascinating and often overlooked moments of history. And as always, if you're in the mood for more stories that combine history, humanity, and a touch of the extraordinary, just let me know in the comments. What other historical periods or events would you like us to explore next? Stay tuned for more.